It's Bradley J. We're live talking about candidates with Rich Rubino, who is a political historian. And by candidates, I mean candidates in debates and moments that have made or broken candidates in debates. How you doing, Rich?
I'm doing well, Bradley. Thanks so much for having me on again today.
Of course, the Republican field is starting to gel up a little bit. So
Yep.
Doug Burgum got in, and he looks good. And it's going to take something special for him to break through, and he needs to make it onto the debate stage. And when he does, maybe he'll be able to say something that punches him through. And a lot of folks like myself are hoping that Christie makes it to the debate stage because he'll be exciting. Who else do you think will actually make it to the debate stage I guess on just the GOP side? Because
Yeah.
will there even be a debate stage on the other side?
No, the Democrats are not going to have any debates.
Right.
The Democratic Party is basically endorsing Joe Biden, so
Okay.
so essentially there won't be.
So we'll take a look at who might be up there, who might shake things up, who might make a mistake, and we'll take a look historically at moments that made or broke candidates in debates. So, who do we have coming up that's likely to be on the debate stage this time around? I understand you have to have at least 1% of the vote in polls or 1% in the polling and have received 40,000 unique donations, is it?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Is that hard to do, I guess? I
Yeah.
guess.
Oh, it absolutely is, and that's one of the reasons some of the candidates are saying it doesn't matter how much you actually contribute. If you contribute a quarter, that's considered a contribution. So essentially, most of the candidates are saying we just want you to give some money so that we can get on the debate stage. It's almost like you're kind of circumventing the system, if you will. But the
Yeah.
obvious answer, yeah,
I wonder why you have to have money given to you. Why can't you just get 40,000 signatures?
that's something the party does not do. That's the way that it gets. That's the way someone would get on the ballot. Certainly, is you have to get a certain amount of
Yeah.
signatures to get on the ballot for as a candidate. But that's
Okay.
not how. That's not how certainly the parties do it in terms of the debate. But it's all basically arbitrary. The parties decide kind of this artificial number in terms of why you get to 40,000, why you get to 1%. It's all basically art. It's all essentially artificial. And these are party-sponsored debates. So theoretically, sometimes there are also campaign forums, and sometimes you'll see other candidates in those forums, and you'll say, why aren't those on the debate stage? And those are obviously the ones that have not been able to secure the money or to secure the 1% in the polls to get there. But obviously, there'll be a lot of candidates who will certainly be left out. And if you're left out of that debate, you're not getting that media attention. It's not so much the actual debate itself, so much of it is the talking about it for the next couple of days. And if somebody does something extremely effective, what often happens the next couple of days, all of a sudden people open up their checkbooks. They open up their checkbooks, and all of a sudden these benefactors start distributing money to that campaign. And sometimes it's somebody that very few people had heard of before, but somehow they've been able to break through.
Okay. Who do we expect to be on that stage today?
I think categorically we can say two, and that's Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump. I can't really see a scenario where they're not in the debate.
Oh, hold on. I thought maybe Donald Trump would sit the first one out.
Yes,
He's saying he's not going to show up. That's my prediction. He will sit the first one out, and he will feel so left out that he will not be able to resist again.
yes, but he will be invited.
Okay.
He'll be invited to the debate, and that's certainly something that he said. And he's basically saying it outright that I'm so far ahead. Why should I do it? And that's actually a strategy that candidates often employ when you're ahead. There's really no reason to participate in a debate because all you can do is essentially lose. That's why back in history, Kennedy and Nixon had the first debate, 1960, and then you would think that it would be continued a trajectory. You'd have it every time the next time, but in 1964, Lyndon Johnson had no reason whatsoever to debate Barry Goldwater. He was ahead by upwards of 30 points, and any criticism he takes for not participating in a debate is really de minimis compared to the possibility that somehow he could falter and Barry Goldwater could actually be effective in that debate. And then in 1968, Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey could not agree whether George Wallace, the third-party candidate, should be in the debates. There were no debates. In 1972, Richard Nixon would not debate George McGovern because Nixon was so far ahead, he had no reason to. But in 1976, you had an interesting phenomenon. Gerald Ford, in the summer of 76, was 34 points behind Jimmy Carter. This was an incumbent president after pardoning Nixon and after the divide in the Republican Party between himself and Ronald Reagan. So he did what was unprecedented. He challenged the challenger to debates, and they actually had debates. And since then, every solitary year, there's been at least one debate.
Well, there is a reason to show up, even though you're way ahead, and that is everyone else on that stage can take punches at you, and you cannot defend yourself, and that might be a thing for Donald Trump, because he has a lot of targets that people can hit on him, and he's a guy who just hates not fighting back. It's going to be. I was thinking maybe he'd sit out the first one. I don't know if he'd be able to sit out the first one. He will take that opportunity to rail against the corrupt charges against the corrupt judge, the corrupt everything. It's a platform for him to rail against everything he hates.
It could be that he calls up, maybe perhaps he either goes on Truth Social, or maybe he calls up other television stations and tries to kind of monopolize almost, maybe like for example, during the 2016 Republican convention, he actually rained in his own parade by calling up Bill O'Reilly and talking to Bill O'Reilly opposite that, while at the same time the convention is going on. So there's always that possibility that he does some sort of a counter program type of a thing, but it is something you risk. I remember, for example, back in 1999, George W. Bush skipped one of the debates because he was attending a ceremony where his wife was getting an award. And so what happens when you're not there, essentially you give free rein for the other candidates to essentially excoriate you, and you're not there to essentially to defend them, to defend yourself. But obviously he was willing to take that risk at that particular time.
All right, so who do you expect to be up there? Who else? Will Doug Burgum make it? Is he North Dakota?
North Dakota, yes.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating question because he's very obscure, but he's somebody who's essentially sold his company to Microsoft. He was a software engineer, probably made $1 billion on it. He's somebody that could spend upwards of $50 million just on television advertisements, and theoretically could get to that point where he actually gets in debate, assuming that his advertisements are that people are actually receptive to what he is saying. So I do see a possibility of that. But you remember, this guy's a tabula rasa, it's a complete clean slate right now. People don't know who he is, and all of a sudden you're going to see these political advertisements all over the internet, basically, of this guy talking about his record in business, his record in North Dakota. So I think it's theoretically possible, but money's one thing, but you also have to have a message that resonates. And sometimes the candidates who raise a lot of money or are self-funded, Steve Forbes comes to mind, Tom Steyer comes to mind, Michael Bloomberg comes to mind. They could raise some money, but when it comes down to it, that could not actually translate into votes. Now, Michael Bloomberg's case, all the money he spent, he won one primary, one caucus, and one primary, and that was American Samoa. So, as American Samoan goes, apparently does not go the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
By the way, speaking of TV commercials, did you see the Koch brothers anti-Trump commercials yet?
Yep, and very
effective.
Very expected. The Koch brothers have very much a rivalry with Donald Trump, so I very much expected they'll do just about anything. They were very much in the camp, for example, in 2016. They're very sympathetic to the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, not supporting the traditional Republican candidate, which they tend to do.
All right. So there's Burgum we don't know about. Christie, he can get 40. He can make it, right?
I think he will. And the latest poll I've seen in New Hampshire has him moving up to about 7% in third place.
7? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. This is one poll. It could be an outlier poll, but he's somebody who has a counter message. He's really going with that counter message. Only him and the former governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, are essentially running on this counter message, basically saying that Trump, basically anti-Trump in many respects, saying that what Trump did was wrong, essentially saying that he was guilty, the charges are serious, that type of thing. So I think he will get into the debate, and he's obviously somebody who's very effective. 2009, he ran for governor, and he really took on the incumbent governor, John Corzine. John Corzine tried to come back at him many times, and there was actually an ad, and there was some suggested that John Corzine was trying to take on Chris Christie because of his weight at the time. But Chris Christie was very effective. He ran for re-election in 2013. He was also very effective in the debate in 2016. He was very effective, not necessarily in taking down Donald Trump, but in taking down Marco Rubio, because Marco Rubio kept on repeating this line that The notion that Barack Obama does not know what he is doing is false. Barack Obama knows exactly what he is doing. And Christie basically said, we keep repeating the same line. And then inextricably, Marco Rubio repeated the line again, allowing Christie to call him out. So I think he's probably the candidate that Trump is probably the most trepidatious about, but he's also as pugilistic as Trump is. I think Trump is he likes to fight. He's very truculent in that respect. I think he's waiting and waiting and waiting, and he really wants to take on Christie just from a personal standpoint.
Oh, yeah. So you are, a historian. Can you answer me this? I was under the impression that if you had been charged with certain crimes, you couldn't serve as president. But now I'm hearing that Trump could serve from his jail cell or from Mar-a-Lago, from somewhere with an ankle bracelet. What's the rule on that?
Yeah, it's very murky. Trump would say yes. There are some people who question whether the 14th Amendment would say that it's something for sedition or that you essentially cannot serve. But I think the prevailing consensus among some historians is that he could serve as president. Now, obviously, that would create a whole group of problems. For example, whole group of issues that we've never had before. For example, where would he get his national security briefings if he's in a prison cell? And is it possible if he has a roommate? Does that mean his roommate is going to have to be taken out while, for example, he has cabinet meetings while the national security team comes in?
No, the answer to that is you have his cabinet also in jail.
Well, theoretically, they could do. I guess they could do it by Zoom, but it depends on whether they have the privileges, and also could they potentially do it during visiting hours? I mean, there are so many questions. And what about Secret Service? Does that mean that the Secret Service is going to have to go with the president and guard his cell? Will they have to go into the president, and will they have to be in prison with him? Will Trump actually get a roommate? I mean, there's so many potential questions. Remember, we have to actually get to this point first. He has to be elected, and then he has to be convicted, right. And we're nowhere near that right now.
Right. I wish somebody would make a movie right now. Make a movie right now based on that, like a real, semi-serious. I don't know how serious. Maybe an Alec Baldwin type of serious movie where the president is serving from jail. Wouldn't that be something? You could even be a TV series. It would be, I don't know.
That would be something that would be very interesting, and certainly something that's unprecedented. We've had presidents who've been unindicted co-conspirators. Richard Nixon, for example. Bill Clinton was potentially going to be indicted, but he made an agreement the last day in office with Robert Ray, who succeeded Ken Starr as the special counsel, that essentially the charges would be dropped if in return he agrees to he accepts that the Arkansas that his law license in Arkansas, where he's not practicing anyways, will be suspended for 5 years. But we've never had, and of course now we have Donald Trump, a former president, being indicted twice. We never had a scenario where a president was actually indicted first and then convicted while in office. I think Nixon was probably the closest. He was not actually impeached. He was the House Judiciary Committee voted out articles of impeachment, which would have then gone to the House floor. The House would have overwhelmingly likely voted for impeachment. Then it would have gone to the Senate. And the story is that Barry Goldwater, Senator from Arizona, Hugh Scott, Senator from Pennsylvania, and Congressman Rhodes, the Senate minority leader, the House minority leader from Arizona, all met with Richard Nixon, and they said essentially that if this goes to the United States Senate, you're probably going to lose. And Barry Goldwater said essentially, you probably have about 8 votes, and I'm not one of them. And so the next day he resigned, and there was a potential that he could have been indicted, arraigned, indicted, and convicted. But of course, Gerald Ford stopped that by pardoning him. And by doing that, also potentially hindered his own bid for a full term in 1976.
So all this talk about the president serving from jail, well, it's not going to happen. I'm sticking by my Trump will not be the nominee, and neither will.
I'm losing you.
Trump will not be the nominee. Can you hear me better now?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. And neither will DeSantis. That's my long shot prediction. I just think things are going to happen. It's a very volatile time. Oh, and I have a nickname for DeSantis, Shemp. You remember he's got this? You remember Shemp from Three Stooges?
Absolutely.
He's got the kind of a Shemp haircut, like the way he combs his hair. I'm going to call him Shemp, and I got to double check and look at a picture of Shemp and make sure I got the right guy. But I don't think it's going to happen. There's too much. For one thing, he's going to lose, and the Republican Party knows that he is a losing candidate. and so, yet somehow he has so much support. They got. You can answer me this. Maybe vote-wise, he wins the nomination, but doesn't the party have any power to say, yeah, he's going to lose. We're not going to run this guy, or can they exert influence during the course of the primaries?
The answer is yes, they could theoretically. The party does control essentially the delegates, and they used to have these scenarios actually. In 1912, for example, Theodore Roosevelt wins essentially more primaries than Taft. Taft just wins Massachusetts. Theodore Roosevelt goes on to win because the party decided William Howard Taft goes on to win because the party decided they wanted William Howard Taft. So what happened? Theodore Roosevelt said, I'm stripped to the buff, and I'm throwing my hat in the ring. This is where that slogan came from. And he runs the Progressive Party candidate and splits the party. But also, in 1968, Eugene McCarthy was winning the primaries as someone who was opposed to the Vietnam War. But the party at the end of the day decided to nix that. They wanted Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president. They wanted him to be the nominee. So Hubert Humphrey gets the nomination, even though he only participated in one primary, South Dakota, where he came in third place. And what do you have? You have riots in the streets. So what happened after that? It was called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. George McGovern, South Dakota, senator, was the leader of this. And in the Democratic Party, they established the rules so the primaries would have more power. The Republican parties then essentially went along with this. Now, the Democratic Party still, for example, has superdelegates. Those are members of the Democratic Party high command, governors, senators, who are essentially unpledged delegates who usually will go to a candidate despite whoever the primary voters decide. So it's theoretically possible. But let me say, if that did happen, first of all, there would probably be riots on the streets. Trump supporters are vociferous for him. And the idea that the establishment of the Republican Party would negate the decision of primary voters, I think that would lead to an absolute revolution, and probably Donald Trump would say, I'm throwing my hat in the ring and I'm running as a third party.
Okay.
And that would split the Republican votes and allow Joe Biden to win.
So, Trump made a direct plea to his followers to come and raise Cain at the indictment in Miami. They didn't show up. It was hardly anybody there, and that was his home territory. I'm not so sure if there'd be riots in the streets. We'll see.
But there certainly could be a split in the Republican Party if Donald Trump decides to leave the Republican Party, get the signatures, and immediately. And I think he could get the signatures relatively quickly. The question would be the deadline for getting actually getting on the ballot as an independent candidate. But that would be very interesting.
So he will stay in the race as long as he can, not only because he likes the trappings of the presidency, so he can take documents and do what he will with them, but this is his bulwark against going to jail. He can claim, oh, this is political. This is political. It keeps anybody else would long since have been dealt with, I think, but there's this protection he gets from his political activities. So even if he feels like, this is too much of a hassle, I'm not into it, I'm losing, he will if he has to do the third party, because then he can claim this is a political witch hunt. By the way, he says it's a witch hunt. And if that's the case, then he's a witch. In this case, the witch is a real thing. And people blame the DOJ for what's going on. Hey, dude, it's your fault. You did these things. There's no denying them that you said you did them. It's on tape that you did them. Other people, witnesses say you did them. It's for real. It's not the DOJ's fault. And it would be a crime if the DOJ let it go. That would be clear there was no equality under the law. See, they have to. You forced their hand. You insulted them. You made them do it. People, it's not the DOJ's fault. And as far as maybe, well, what about Hillary? What about Hillary? Okay, if you want to put Hillary in jail, I'm fine. If it means Trump goes to jail, same with Hunter Biden. Put Hunter Biden on trial. I don't care. Go ahead. Why don't you do that to take the wind out of their sails? Why don't they? Put Hunter Biden on trial. Let the courts figure it out.
It comes down to one thing: conformity. And this goes for both sides. We're in an age now, we're polarized, where essentially everyone wants to be part, at least politically, of an affinity group. a group, a conformity group, if you will. And it's whether you're for Trump or you're against Trump. And essentially, you want to be with people, and you want to be in your people want to be in their ideological silos, if you will, or their partisan silos. And they essentially, it becomes like voting for the Padres or voting for the Oakland Athletics.
Right.
You are just, it becomes a team type of a thing. And I don't even think it's about Donald Trump per se on the Democratic side, not necessarily about Joe Biden. It's about wanting to be a part of a group, and very much a group that feels displaced. So as soon as somebody immediately says, what about Donald Trump? Donald Trump should be indicted. The immediate retort is, well, what about Hunter Biden? What about Hillary Clinton? And if you go on the other side and you say, you know what, look at what's going on with Hunter Biden. Why isn't the media covering this? If you hear what Chuck Grassley said, people immediately say, well, what about Donald Trump? We're in this age of kind of whataboutism, if you will, where people will not alter their opinion because it's so ingrained inside of the membrane that it's almost insane.
So another word for it, at a more root level, is tribalism. Tribalism's always been a thing, but
absolutely.
Now it's my tribe against your tribe. Yeah, our guy happens to be a bad person, but we can't admit that because our tribe is against your tribe. So let's go back to who else is going to show up in this debate and talk about some debate moments, some make and break debate moments. It's my fault we have gotten away from that.
Oh, no, it's great. I think that Vivek Ramaswamy, which I can never say, the businessman who's really trying vociferously to get into the debate, there's a possibility he'll get into debate. He's at 3 or 4% right now. I think there's a very good chance that he actually gets into debate, and he's somebody who's very much alternative, a tech entrepreneur. I think that you're probably going to see Nikki Haley. I can't imagine a scenario where she doesn't get to that point. She's certainly over that 1% right now, and I think she's certainly going to get a lot of money. Tim Scott's, by the way, the candidate I think the Democrats probably fear most, because he's somebody who is very much conservative in the Trump mold, but also somebody who can be seen as an establishment Republican, and somebody who also comes off as optimistic and non-threatening, if you will. He has a very charismatic persona, very gentle persona in many respects, so he can essentially talk in conservative rhetoric without necessarily sounding like an intransigent ideologue. So he's somebody that they probably fear in many respects. And I think that, obviously obviously, who knows what's going to happen with Mayor Suarez of Miami, who just announced yesterday. He's somebody who's very much a counter-programming Republican. He's very much a moderate or even a liberal Republican. He's somebody who in 2018 admitted to voting for Andrew Gillum, the Democratic nominee against Ron DeSantis. Now, the question and then in 2000, he said he voted against, in 2020, he said he voted against Donald Trump, rather. So is there a possibility, what is he potentially looking at if it's such a far-fetched that he can actually become president? Well, potentially what I think, if you're really a cold calculation here, what he may be looking, Ron DeSantis is term limited in Florida. So if he becomes president, Lieutenant Governor succeeds him, or he does not become president, serves out his full term, there's going to be an open race for governor of Florida in 2028. So it could be that he's trying to meet benefactors, meet donors, put his name on a national name recognition, so that as soon as as the presidential election is over, as people are looking for the governorship in Florida in 2028, he has the name recognition and he scares out other primary opponents because of his past performance. That's potentially, I think, the cold calculated position. Or maybe he does somehow see this scenario where the Republicans are going to nominate somebody who's not necessarily an unadulterated conservative, but I certainly think he's somebody that if he ever becomes a major candidate, that Trump will immediately use what's the ultimate term of derision amongst Republicans, which is the term rhino, Republican in name only, which Trump supporters tend to use very effectively as a cudgel against anybody who does not walk the party line in the Republican conformity.
So one thing, probably the most important question any of these candidates will be asked is, will you pardon Trump?
Yep.
That is, who will say no? Only Christie would have the sack to say no. Asa would say no?
Oh, Asa. Yeah, I think Asa would say no. Asa is very much somebody who is, by the way, notice that both of these candidates are candidates who do not hold public office. Of course, and they probably are not going to run for public office in their states. Again, that I think gives them some potential liberty to move off of that kind of traditional reservation, if you will, of supporting Trump and saying that they will essentially pardon them. But if you actually have office, and if you actually are thinking about running for office again in the Republican Party, you know that that's going to potentially hurt you, particularly if you want to run for re-election, for example.
I feel that there's going to be a tipping point, where all of a sudden Trump will be more toxic than he is a benefit, and they will dump him. They won't have to carry his water anymore, and they won't have to say, "I will pardon him." There's enough time between now and the election for the drip, drip, drip of his core to fall off a little bit, enough. So he's just unsavory enough. So it will be a liability for them to say they'll pardon him. I'm sticking with that theory too.
The only shake in his armor that I can think of is the fact that in terms of the primary, he has not consolidated support amongst many mega Republicans, state senators, for example. Both senators in North Dakota are supporting Doug Burgum, for example, and some congressmen, conservatives like Bob Good from Virginia, and is supporting Ron DeSantis. So he does not necessarily monopolize that wing of the party, meaning that essentially they do not fear him.
Right.
I mean, which I think that shows a lot of these Republicans might potentially be saying, even if they don't like him, they're going to say, I support Donald Trump, because they fear him potentially supporting a primary challenger. Even Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who Donald Trump took out of obscurity working on her father's presidential campaign, Mike Huckabee. Sarah Huckabee Sanders has not officially endorsed Donald Trump yet.
Wow.
So there's obviously some fear. Now, she's the successor of Asa Hutchinson, so she kind of has a conflict of interest there. It's like Rob Emanuel, for example, who came from Barack Obama's home state but worked for Hillary Clinton, kind of got a pass back in 2008 for staying neutral. But that's something I do find interesting. But DeSantis, on the other hand, and this shows, I think, the lack of fear of DeSantis. He only has one member of the entire House delegation from Florida, the U.S. House delegation, that's supporting him. Many are supporting Donald Trump. And what he did yesterday is he essentially, using his line item veto, he struck out certain projects that were authored by members of the Florida legislature, many of whom are supporting Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election. So in many respects, Ron DeSantis knows the cold, hard retribution of politics. Now, contrary-wise, when Tom Harkin ran in 1992 in the Iowa caucuses, he had the entire Iowa delegation sold up. No candidate even campaigned in Iowa, except for minor candidates like Tom Laughlin, because the former actor, because they knew that Tom Harkin was so popular there. And Paul Tsongas that year won the state of New Hampshire. And he won it because he was from a neighboring state, and he wasn't even from the state of New Hampshire. Ed Muskie won New Hampshire because he was from a neighboring state. But it's just so interesting that you have DeSantis only getting one supporter from the state of Florida, because that's a congressman. And both Rick Scott, the senator, and Marco Rubio, the United States senator, have been neutral so far. On the other hand, Donald Trump, many former past mega Republicans who are very supportive of Donald Trump in the past, are not supporting him. And then you look in the state of South Carolina. South Carolina, you have Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina. He does not have one member of the congressional delegation supporting him. And Lindsey Graham, his colleague, is supporting Donald Trump. And then you have Nikki Haley, who's the former governor of South Carolina, and Henry McMaster, who was lieutenant governor when she was governor and succeeded her as governor. He immediately went out and supported Donald Trump. So this is just a weird, wacky world on the political sphere.
Yep. Well, they felt they had to do that to survive politically. I think they're losing the fear. One key point was when the indictment was read and folks found out what the documents were. There was somebody running for office. No, actually, some sitting politician last night I saw on TV said, when he might have been in the House, it looked like he might have been in that up second level of the rotunda there, in the Capitol. Said when I read the indictment, I can't take it anymore. Those documents were too dangerous. And now let me ask you this and then we really got to get into key moments.
Yes.
You have Judge Eileen Cannon, who is, when she was appointed, hadn't been a judge at all, as I understand it. And even since then, it's only been spent 14 days in doing her, being a judge. That hasn't been very active. wildly incompetent and wildly in favor of Trump. I'm not I don't really know how it works out, other than she was tapped initially, so she's naturally tapped again for this portion of the program. But I'm thinking that there are noticeably conspicuously absent charges and things mentioned, namely those emanating from Bedminster, and that Jack Smith may be keeping his powder dry in case Aileen Cannon goes south to charge him again in Bedminster. And that's the Bedminster venue is where the disbursement took place and would be charged there. What do you think? Is another indictment coming in New Jersey?
I can certainly see a possible scenario, not to mention Georgia and Fulton County, Georgia, too. It's interesting, though, you get back to the whole judicial process. And obviously, you do have checks and balances in the system. Alexander Hamilton called the judiciary the least dangerous branch. But you do have this scenario where the president nominates just not only Supreme Court justices, but lower inferior court judges as well. And the Senate obviously confirms them. But it's a political process because obviously Donald Trump is not going to, when he's looking for a judge, first of all, lots of times it's recommendations on the part of senators from his own party, if they have senators from their own party in that state. But that's usually what it is. He's probably not going to be looking for somebody who's a progressive. He's probably going to be looking for someone that's ideologically in his mold. So obviously that person's going to be very indebted to Donald Trump, just like on the Democratic side. If a Democrat nominates somebody, they're probably going to be indebted to that person.
Right.
There's no way to really get politics out of this other than potentially having some sort of potentially federal elections where the people elect the judges directly, which is certainly not going to happen.
That's a terrible idea too, because then the judges would be, make a decision based on votes.
Well, they have that in many states, and the judges literally are going, literally have to go to the people, and they have to go and they have to run political ads, just like, for example, DAs do in most states. So I don't really know how you necessarily get the political process out of this, but whoever gets the case is either going to be appointed by a Republican president or a Democratic president.
Right. So Laura Pope's been active today. Laura Pope from up in Maine. And she says here they're using this new judge because she can't support Trump in this case, but because she is a Trump supporter. I see what you're saying. You're saying for appearance's sake, you have a Trump supporter do it. But since she was so roundly condemned for her idiot decision previously, that she would have to toe the line and do the right thing. Her refusal to pardon his behavior will shut the door, and they can't claim that it's a Trump-hating judge. So I don't know. We'll see. This guy Jack Smith is a badass, I gotta say. Once I feel like Merrick Garland was, kind of mamby-pamby, and things dragged on. But then when he appointed Jack Smith has only been on the job, 6 months? And this is a super complicated case, and he's got two of them. And, he seemed to have dotted his I's and crossed his T's, and also he's showing up in court. That was pretty, strong move, I would say.
Although indictments are pretty easy to get for the prosecution, with indictments are generally
it's just enough evidence
to go. It's just an evidence to go to trial. When you're actually at trial, though, in many respects, the system is very much benefits the defendant more so than the prosecution. For example, it's not like in a civil trial where it has to be preponderance of the evidence, which is essentially 51%. Yeah. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you can't persuade all 12 jurors, then essentially you're not going to get that conviction. Yeah. So it's very hard in that respect. That's why you would ask the question to the prosecution, if they're going to obviously indictments are easy, but the fact that they would actually take this case to trial would show to me that they think they have enough evidence to persuade 12 jurors and beyond a reasonable doubt.
The only way you're going to lose is if you get some freak juror that's just not going to pay attention to the facts at all. You're right. They would not have brought it unless they were as positive can be that they could win it, because losing it would be disaster. But
Well,
you
the
have
question,
to. There's so much evidence. So, like, Trump confesses. What he has done is essentially confessed to most of the charges. I mean,
well,
not most of the charges, but substantial charges.
you
Yeah,
also
I
wonder,
took them. I did it. Yes, and says, "Oh yeah, well, I should have done it when I was president. Now I don't have the authority to do it." And waving this document around, it would be malpractice to not bring the charges. You have to bring the charges. So
well, you
I
also
can't wait
wonder,
for the Bedminster charges. I got to tell you, can't
you
wait.
wonder though for a juror, is there anybody in the country who is neutral about Donald Trump and who can say completely, you know what, I don't really have much very strong opinion on him. I think even the most low propensity voter, it's just a gut visceral reaction. As soon as you say, this isn't like somebody like, this isn't Gerald Ford, who people might say, well, he's all right. In Donald Trump's case, everyone has an opinion. So how do you find somebody who's going to be impartial? How can you be impartial about Donald Trump? Who are these people that they're going to have
Right.
to find?
So much of it depends on the jury foreperson who,
Yep.
if is charismatic and strong enough, can browbeat some weird doubter, some outlier into getting in line. Let's see. I didn't proofread this. Lydia Sampson comes to us from Rhode Island. Unless she's at work, which would be in Norwood, I guess. The only defenses I hear are whataboutism of conspiracy theories. Yes, right. Yeah. Corrupt. Justice Department is corrupt and a hoax. Interesting, in the indictment, the first paragraphs of the indictment are Trump talking about how important it is to keep documents safe and how he's going to enforce that and he's going to keep them safe and stuff. All right. Get me back to the debates. Key moments now
Yes.
where that have made or broken candidates in debates.
The best one I can think of was probably, this shows how well his staff prepared him. Back in 1988, you had Dick Gephardt, congressman from Missouri, who won the Iowa caucuses, came in second to Mike Dukakis in New Hampshire, and was a very formidable candidate. And you had Al Gore, 40-year-old senator from Tennessee, who was locking up support, but only Southern conservative Democrats. He was the last kind of Southern conservative who I think ran essentially as a moderate to conservative Democrat. He said, a Democrat we can vote for. That's what he would say in his advertisements. He went to North Carolina and showed off about the fact that he had worked on his dad's tobacco farm, for example. And Dick Gephardt kept going after him, and he was talking about how Al Gore, he said, you're essentially trying to bring us back to the days of states' rights. We don't need to bring Strom Thurmond back to the Democratic Party. Strom Thurmond was a former states' rights Democrat who left the party in 1948, ran for the states' rights party, Dixiecrat ticket, then came back to the Democratic Party, eventually became a Republican. And Dick Gephardt looks at him and he says, and in this debate, he says, you're starting to, now Al Haig, by the way, he was the former Secretary of State he was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. And he was the guy who said, I'm in charge. And he was also running on the Republican ticket. And he says, in this race, Al, you're starting to sound a lot more like Al Haig than Al Gore.
Right.
And Gore comes right back at him. And he acerbates. And that answer sounds a lot more like Richard Nixon than Richard Gephardt.
Wow.
And I think that was just one of the best lines I have ever heard in a presidential debate. But also Al Gore made a mistake. In one of the debates, they were asking candidates, if you in the Oval Office, if you could put a picture of a president, who would you put up? So Jesse Jackson says Lyndon Johnson because of the Great Society and civil rights. And Al Gore says, well, some of the traditional like Franklin Roosevelt, but also James Knox. And people are saying, who? Well, he meant to say James Polk, James Knox Polk, but he said James Knox, which is kind of odd that he would say James K. Polk as the president that he would put up there. But he said because, like himself, James K. Polk was a dark horse presidential candidate. And this is true. James K. Polk was a former Speaker of the House and a former governor who lost his re-election bid in Tennessee. He was not the front runner in 1844. Former President Martin Van Buren was, but eventually he wins the nomination. So that was a mistake that he made in that debate, in another debate. But Al Gore's first line, I thought, was the best one I've ever heard.
Plus, saying James Polk, that's a boring answer. Nobody out there even knows anything about James Polk.
But he's a Tennessean who was a dark horse, and so Al Gore's saying, essentially, I relate to him in that respect.
So what about meltdowns like Dukakis and his, what would you do if Kitty got raped?
Yeah, irreparable. Yeah. That was
got to be ready for that. You got to go. I don't I'm not in favor of state-sponsored murder in the form of the death penalty, but I personally would hunt the guy down. He could say that. Everybody would get it.
That was asked by Bernie Shaw. It was the first question at debate. He said, would you favor the irrevocable death penalty? And Mike Dukakis says, no, I don't, Bernard. And I think you know that in my entire career, I've opposed the death penalty, and gives a very intellectual answer. And Dukakis that year, his slogan was competence over ideology. He was trying to basically present himself as a technocrat.
That's such an academic slogan with no zip to it.
Yes.
What was it? Competence over what?
Competence
ideology?
Over, well, he was the reason he said that is because the Massachusetts liberal is a term of derision and poison in American politics. And the fact that Dukakis is from Massachusetts gives George H.W. Bush, casus belli, to go right after him and say, this is a Massachusetts liberal. He used to always say the governor from Massachusetts, the governor from Massachusetts. He kept saying the governor from Massachusetts. And every time you say that, people immediately think Massachusetts, and they think Cambridge, and they think far left liberals. So that was essentially why Dukakis would say, well, it's really about competence rather than ideology. But at the end of the day, Dukakis lost that election by 10 points and only won 10 states.
Kamala Harris really went after Biden during the debates.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Called out his stand on forced busing to schools. In my opinion, the way that Biden should deal with that, or anybody should deal with it, if it's a known fact, to go, yep, it was a mistake. That's all you got to say. Oh, okay, moving on.
Right.
If you take the air out of that balloon by just saying, it was a mistake. I mean, the guy's been in service forever. Public service is going to do some stuff that turns out that went south. I think that's all you got to say. What else? You got your Christie Rubio moment.
Here's one, which I think is probably one I always say is probably the best moment, certainly just watching it. So back in 1992, Paul Tsongas, Bill Clinton, Jerry Brown were the last three remaining Democratic candidates. And Bill Clinton had just about clinched the nomination. And there was a debate where Jerry Brown starts going after Bill Clinton and talking about how there was an article in the New York Times that day talking about how Bill Clinton supposedly, allegedly, his wife Hillary, who worked at the Rose Law Firm in Arkansas, her firm benefited from Bill Clinton being governor of Arkansas. So Jerry Brown goes after, points her finger at him, and starts saying, and then Bill Clinton looks at him and says, "Now, Jerry, you can go after me, but you don't. But how dare you go after my wife? You don't belong on the same stage as my wife. You come here in this $1,500 suits." He said, "Pat Goodell, who was an advisor, had told me you're going to do this today." And then Jerry Brown said, "Well, Ralph Nader pointed to this me in the New York Times." And then Bill Clinton says, "Well, does that make it true? Does that make it true?" Then someone said, said about the relationship with Jerry Brown, and he said, "Well, Jerry asked me to. Jerry, you said I was going to. You wanted me to support you when you ran for president one time." The moderator said, "Did you?" And Bill Clinton says, "No, of course not." But it really just showed Bill Clinton essentially trying to take on Jerry Brown as this elitist. It was just in this fancy suit who's trying to take on his wife, who's doing this as a desperation measure, if you will. And Bill Clinton ends up clinching the nomination, and Jerry Brown never endorses Bill Clinton. At the convention that year, the convention in New York City, New York that year, 1992, Jerry Brown uses a little-known procedure at the in the Democratic Party rules that allows somebody to speak if they're nominating themselves for president. So other governors that did not support Bill Clinton did not come out for him, like Governor Casey, for example, was not allowed to speak, but Jerry Brown was allowed to speak. And he got up there and he gave an oration. He talked about campaign finance reform. He talked about how the system was corrupt, talked about his own campaign. He never mentioned the name Bill Clinton in that address and did not endorse Bill Clinton. They had a very bitter rivalry. After Bill Clinton was elected, Frank Sesno interviewed Jerry Brown in 1995, and Jerry Brown talked about how the whole political process. He said, "You know what? Basically, it's all a scam." He says, "Bush didn't have a plan. Clinton didn't have a plan." He said, "I didn't have a plan in California." And he said, "You want low taxes, your taxes go up. You want better education, your education stinks." This is Jerry Brown a few years after his presidential race saying that. Now, you talk about a comeback. In 2000 and in 1992, he also ran on a flat tax, 13% flat tax in the Democratic primary. And Arthur Laffer, who had the Laffer curve, who was very much a supply side advocate, a supply side exponent who very much wanted tax cuts, was an advisor to Jerry Brown, someone who had also advised Ronald Reagan. By 2010, He essentially almost did a mea culpa, came back to the political establishment, ran for governor of California, and Bill Clinton was right there campaigning for him.
I can't wait for these debates. I got to tell you, it would seem to me that if Donald Trump's standing on this stage, every candidate could do this. They'd be asked a question. Nikki Haley, how do you feel about XYZ? And she could say, well, I don't know about XYZ, but I do know that Donald Trump tried to overthrow the United States government and subvert the Constitution of the United States in an ongoing, multi-level, highly planned attack on the United States. Couldn't everyone do that all day long? And wouldn't that have an effect?
Yeah.
I don't know about this. I don't know about XYZ, Bob, but Donald Trump took sensitive documents concerning our nuclear programs, nuclear capability, and waved them around. Or actually, that our planned attack on Iran and waved them around. Couldn't they just do that all day long? Doesn't Donald Trump have any vulnerability for this stuff that he did?
The general rule on that, though, is you do answer the question, then you divert. You don't immediately divert because then you appear that you're waffling. So
that you don't know.
You don't say you don't know. You answer it in a few words. You say, well, I do support that, but now let's get back to that. And it reminds me, actually, the person who did this perfectly was George W. Bush in 1994 when he was running for governor of Texas. Ann Richards was his opponent. Ann Richards had a 60% personal approval rating on election day, and Bush still beat her. In part, Ann Richards, no matter what, they asked Bush a question about his leadership of Arbusto or Harkin Energy, and there were supposed scandals involved. And George W. Bush was able to come back no matter what they asked the question. He said, well, what we really need is our children need to learn how to read. We need welfare reform. We need juvenile justice reform, and we need tort reform. And people remembered it because he kept repeating the same line over and over and over again. But Marco Rubio tried that. No matter what they would ask him, he would say, the notion that Barack Obama does not know what he is doing is a fiction. Barack Obama knows exactly what he's doing. He knew to stay on message. And in his case,
it made him look like a robot.
Unlike Ann Richards, Christie called him out on that, and he still repeated it after that. And as a result, since then, Marco Rubio was basically belittled. And there was a guy up in New Hampshire who was dressed as a robot who would walk around as a Marco Rubio robot. So it became kind of making fun of it. So I guess the point of there is there's a happy medium. There's a golden mean, if you will. On the one hand, you stay on message. That's true. You do stay on message, and you do divert. If you don't want to answer a question, you want to take somebody on directly, you use your time to do that. On the other hand, if you keep repeating the same line verbatim and you try to stay on message to that point, then you're no longer a human being, and then all of a sudden you're a robot. And you know what? Robots don't have a constituency in American politics that will try to support them.
Yeah, Rubio's so weak, just so weak. There are a lot of other words I could use if it weren't public. And speaking of robotic, there's something malevolently robotic about DeSantis. That guy, as I mentioned, he's a dud. And there's something about him that's not likable at all. Actually, there's nothing about him likable, and there's something distinctly unlikable. When he answers a question to the press, he does it in this weird, nasty way. It's not, well, thank you for the question, Bob. It's like, well, like I've said 1,000 times, etc. What is your thought on the Trump indictment? Well, I have talked about this. The guy, Shemp, I'm calling him. Please, everyone, go look and see if he's got this Shemp haircut. And he's, God. Okay, well, this one here, maybe this is true. Maybe this is the king of these moments. How about the moment that Admiral looked at Dan Quayle and said, Senator, you are no Jack Kennedy.
Yes.
Isn't that the king of the moments right there?
Yes. So this was 1988. Lloyd Benson was a senator from Texas, and Dan Quayle was talking about his age. And he said, essentially, I have more experience at this point in my life than Jack Kennedy did. To which Lloyd Benson looked at him and said, Senator, I knew Jack Kennedy. I served with Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. And Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy. Dan Quayle retorts, that was uncalled for, Senator, and the audience applauds even though they're not supposed to. In actuality, though, Lloyd Benson barely knew Jack Kennedy. It was obviously a line that they had prepared, but he was not really friends with him in the House. He was friends with Lyndon Johnson, certainly, but he was not friends with Jack Kennedy. But it was a line that certainly was the one thing when people think of Lloyd Benson, one of the few things that they remember about him is that one line going against Dan Quayle in that debate.
So it seems like one of the most important activities that a team can do is to do scouting on previous talks. Just go look at speeches everywhere and see the things they tend to say when asked a certain question, and then have locked and loaded crusher responses to those things that they tend to say. You got to do your homework on how they answer questions to be ready. Like maybe he had said that before. Maybe they'd heard him say, at this point, I have more experience than Jack Kennedy. And that's how they came up with, that's how they knew to say that, because they knew that would be coming down the pike at some point.
I think the best thing to do too is try to reach out to anybody who's debated the person in the past. If you, for example, when John Kerry, who was a very effective debater in 2004, the first thing I would do if I'm running against John Kerry, I'd reach out to Bill Weld, because Bill Weld had run against him in 1996 and was very effective against him, and knew the lines John Kerry would use, and knew kind of this type of a strategy. If I was running against Bill Clinton in 1992, the first person I would go to two people. The first would be Frank White, because Frank White actually beat Bill Clinton in 1980 in his first re-election bid. And he debated him also in 1982 when he ran for re-election, and then he debated him in 1986. Then I go to Sheffield Nelson, because Sheffield Nelson debated him in 1990, and I go through and I say, what essentially are all the tricks that he uses? What are his go-to lines? But also kind of what do you think his ultimate debate strategy was? If I was taking on Mitt Romney and I was Barack Obama, who do you go to? Shannon O'Brien, because Shannon O'Brien ran against Mitt Romney in 2002 in the gubernatorial race in Massachusetts, and they had some very contentious debates. But go to anybody who's debated the person before, and even go to the people who prepped them in those previous debates and say, what were you looking for, and did what you were looking for, did the person actually perform the way that you thought they would?
Let's wrap this up. Before we go, let's take a look at your book. It's the Great American Political Trivia Book on Steroid. No, but yeah, say it.
The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids.
The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids. I will remember that. I should make a point to remember that. I say it every week. And my plug to you would be visit my YouTube travel channel, Bradley J. Travel. Just search Bradley J. Travel on YouTube. Rich, thanks very much. A lot of fun today. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
I love this. Thanks so much, Bradley.
Okay. Bye-bye, all. And there we go.